Hi, welcome back to another tutorial for our Tic Tac Toe game. We're programming something in C# to learn how object-oriented programming works. We're in part 3, which is going to create a graphical user interface version of the game. So when we're done, we're going to have an app that looks like this here. You can see that we click on a button, which provides us with an X or an O. Then the computer will either determine if the game is won or if it's a tie, and it'll tell us who wins. So that's what we're going to code right now. So let's switch back to Visual Studio. Right now we have the console version of the game, so we can see that we have two projects. One's called Board Logic, which we will use again for the third phase of this app. We will ignore this one here, which is the program CS file, which we've been working on for the last two videos. So we're going to move away from console app and make a graphical user interface version. So let's start by making a new project. So let's go to the top where the solution is and choose Add, and let's make a new project. So we're going to switch now to a different project type. Instead of library, we want to have a desktop version. And so we're going to pick one of these here. So I'm looking for Windows Forms app with the .NET framework, and we'll choose Next. Let's give it a name. So for this project, I'm going to name it as Tic Tac GUI, and so that stands for Graphical User Interface. When you're finished, it should show up with a Form 1 on the screen, so we can start to place buttons and other things if we wish. So let's look here in the Solution Explorer, and we have three projects. You can see that we have the Board 1 Logic. We're going to keep using that. Now we have the Graphical User Interface, and then we have this one here, which is Tic Tac Toe, the console version. Notice that this one is listed in bold font. I think that means that this was the one that's going to run if we click the Start button. So we're going to have to change the startup project because we want to show the WinForms one. So let's just test that theory. I'm going to click the Start button and see what comes up. And sure enough, you can see that we're still working with the console version. So I don't want that one to work. I want the other one to show up. So let's go to the Solution, choose Properties by right-clicking and go down to Properties. And then you can see here in the Startup project, we have three choices. Now, the one called the Logic doesn't make any sense. That can't start up. It's not a main program. It's not a Windows Forms. It's just a class. However, we can choose the Graphical User Interface and then choose OK. So now this one here is listed in bold font, which means if I run the app, it should show a form. And when I click Start, sure enough, Form 1 appears on the screen. So we're going to have the Graphical User Interface version appear when we run it. Now it's time to start laying out all of the controls on our screen. So I want to have a grid of 9 buttons plus a new game button. So let's set that up. So I'm going to start by creating a panel. Now a panel is just a container to hold buttons or any other kind of a control. And it's useful because it will tell you the boundaries of where your game board is. Now I'm going to put 9 buttons in here. But before I do, I want to make sure I got the right size. So I'm going to assume that each button is 150 pixels. And so that's the width and the height. Now I want 3 by 3. So 150 plus 150 plus 150 is 450 pixels. So I'm going to set the 450 for the size of this panel. Both the width and the height will be 450. So let's go down to the properties here. So the properties are at the bottom here of the Solution Explorer. So expand this if you need to. And let's go find the word size. So I find size way at the bottom, and it looks like I don't have quite a square here, so I'm going to type in 450, 450, and then press Enter. I can also see the size if I click the plus sign, and you can see that the width and the height are both listed as 450. And now we have a perfect square here. So I'm going to resize the form so that way it leaves a little bit of room at the bottom, and we've got ourselves the panel mostly in the center. Now it's time to put some buttons on the screen. So I'm going to go find the button, which is near the top, and drag it over. Now I want to manually try to place this, and then you're going to notice it's very difficult to get a perfect square. So is that the right size? Well, we can use some math instead of just using our eyeballs to figure out if it's in the right spot. So button 1 has the same properties as the panel. You can have the size. So I'm looking at the size properties. I'm going to change this to 150, 150. So now I have a perfect squared button. Now the location also is here at 3, 3. I want to move that right up to the corner, so I'm going to put 0, 0. And so now it's right in the corner of the panel. So this is why I used a panel instead of just throwing the buttons on, because 0, 0 now refers to the upper left corner of the button in relation to its parent container. And the parent container is the panel. So 0, 0 means top left of the container. Now I'm going to make some more buttons. So I can just press Control C, Control V, and now button 2 shows up. Let's see if I can just drop him into place. And let's see what comes out here. So I got close. I want my location to be right next to the previous button. So it says it's at 147. I want that to be 150, 0, which pushes it right up to the top and right next to the previous button. Let's do another paste. Let's come over here and choose Control V for paste. And let's drag this one in. He's going to need some extra help, so the location should be at 300, 0. And now we've got 3 buttons in a row. Let's keep pasting these and repositioning them so that they fit into a perfect 9-grid pattern. All right, so I'm going to continue on. Now each calculation means that we're going to have this line up relatively right next to the other buttons. So remember, the width and the height of the button is 150. So we're looking at multiples of 150 for the top and the left position. So for example, button number 5, which is right in the center, should be at left is 150, top is 150. That's its location inside of the panel. So when we're done, we're going to have 9 buttons that all fit together in a tight grid. Now there's one more button that's going to be different than the others. So let's drag a new button to the bottom. And let's just give this button, button 10, let's give him a new text. And we're going to say that this is for the new game. So new game. And he's going to be handled differently than all the rest of the buttons. So the first thing I want to do is initialize the board when the game launches. So let's double click on the form. So I'm in this area down here where there are no buttons. I'm double clicking, and that will create a method here called form1. And so form1 load is going to happen when the program is first displayed on the screen. Let's do one more button click. So if I were to double click on this item, new game, then I have another method that is going to trigger whenever I click this button. So I'm only going to have these 2 as manual events that I'm going to double click on. The rest of them I'm going to create programmatically. So first of all, let's put some stuff at the top here. I want to be able to get the game board logic. So just like we did in the previous, we're going to have a board class, and I'm going to make a new instance of it. So let's go and call it the game. Now we're going to have a red line that says you cannot see this class. It is not part of this project. And so it asks me, do you want to generate a new version of it? No, I want to use one that's already there. So I showed you how to make a reference to another project in the previous video. You can actually do that quickly if you go to the last item here, which says add a reference. So if I click here, we're going to have the error go away. And what happened was that the line 1 includes a reference to the other project. If I wanted to check to see where that reference was, I could right-click on the project and try to add a reference. Let's see what happens when I go right-click, add reference, and you should see that the board logic has been checked. So this one we want to have a reference to because that contains the logic for our game. So I don't really need to change anything here, so I'll just choose cancel. Now we've got a new game, and we're ready to start updating the buttons based on what that game is going to have for data. Now I'm going to do some initialization for all of the values in my program. And this class right here has a constructor. So form1 is the name of this function, which means this is called whenever the form1 is first instantiated. So right away, I'm just going to make sure that the game has a new version of the board class. So I will say game equals new board. Now I want to have another list, an array of buttons. So let's declare a list up here at the very top. These are called class level variables, which means they're visible to all functions inside of this class. So I'm going to make a new array of type button. So we'll call it buttons, and we'll make it a new array of 9 items, 9 buttons. Now, this doesn't have anything in it yet, so we're going to have to fill this class or fill this list with all of the buttons that I've created on the form. So let's do that down here in the constructor area. So for the first item in the buttons array, which is buttons at 0, we're going to insert the first button that I put on the form, which happens to be button 1. So you can see that the array starts at number 0, but the button counter, or the names of the buttons, starts at 1. So we're off by 1 each of these times. And at first it seems like it's going to take some effort to do this, but believe me, later on we can do things in for loops and in groups, which will shorten our code by a lot. So we're going to rename all of the indexes from 0 all the way up to the number 8. So remember, arrays are starting at 0. And each item in the array will contain a button, so we're going to name that from button 1 all the way up to button 9. Now I'm going to add a common click handler for each of these buttons, because we don't want to have 9 different functions, one for each button. I want to have one function that can be used to handle a click from any of these buttons. So this is a programmatic approach to adding a click listener. So I'm going to make a for loop that will go through each item in this list of buttons. For each item, I am going to then add an event called click. And I'm going to use the plus equal operator, which means whatever event is associated with a click on this button, I'm going to add something to it. I'm going to invent a function or a method, and I'm going to name it called handle button click. And so this will be one function that will respond to any button that is clicked. Now you can see that this method doesn't exist yet, so let's go and ask for some suggestions. So let's hover, choose potentials, and let's see if we can generate one. So we have a suggestion that says go ahead and generate this, and let's see what happens. So we have handle button click, and it provided us with a method that is in the correct format. You notice there are 2 different items in the parameters. So I would have never thought of this unless you either look it up in the manual or let the computer write the code for you, which is very nice that Visual Studio does that for you. So what does this mean? So first of all, it says the first parameter is an object called sender. So that is going to be the value of whichever button it was that clicked. And then we're going to have an event arg, which is an argument or some other issues or other data points, we could call them, about the button and how it was clicked. We're not going to use this E value, but we are going to use sender. So before we use sender, I'm going to add another item to each of these buttons inside of this for loop. What I want to do is add something called a tag. So let's do a buttons I again, and this time type in the word tag. Now you ask, what is a tag? So a tag is a property of a button that can handle any kind of a data. So it can be an integer, it can be a string, you can make it an object, you can make it an object of 2 items, you can make it a full array. So any kind of a thing or any kind of a data structure you can put in there, we can assign to the tag. So I'm just going to use the letter I, or the number I, which is the value of the button. So we'll have a ready-made identifier, you might say, for which button we're talking about. So let's see if we can test this out. So I'm going to see if this handler will be able to identify which button was clicked. So I'm going to say, we'll make a new variable, we'll call it clicked button, and he is going to be the sender. So we're just going to say equals whatever the sender is. Now you're going to notice that when we go to sender, it says this actually doesn't work because sender is of type object and clicked button is of type button. So it says can't do that. Are you missing a cast? So a cast means I'm going to convert from one type into the other. So the sender could be a picture, it could be a menu, it could be any type of control on the screen, but I am going to say, I promise you that this was actually a button. And so casting to a button will work if I actually set up the click listeners correctly. So let's test it out by putting a message box up, and I'm going to say that button number was clicked. And so the button number is literally the tag. So if we assign the proper number to the tag, it should show up when we click it. So it's time to test our app. Let's run it and see what we get. So hopefully I can click a button and show the number of that button. So here's the app. Let's see, I click button 2 and it says button 1 was clicked. Is that the correct one? I think it is. So if I click the first item, it says button 0 was clicked. So even though the text on the front says button 9 or whatever, it's going to be one less as its tag value. So they all seem to be working. And now if I click the new game button, you can see nothing happens because that one doesn't have a click listener associated with it. So that's a good place that we've tested out our app. And now we're ready to make the game actually work. We're going to place an X or an O depending on whose turn it is. So we'll get started on that next. All right, now it's time to update the buttons based on what is contained in the game list. So what I mean by the game list is this here. We have the board class called game, and now we have a bunch of buttons that are also listed in an array. So we should be able to go through a loop and to associate one with the other. So we're going to make these link up. So let's start with form load. This is where the game is first shown on the screen. So what I want to do is create a new method here. So since I want this to be its own function, I'm going to just name a function called updateBoard. And you can see that it doesn't exist, so I'm going to go to the suggestions and tell it to generate one. So it will create one for me. So this one here is where we're going to do all of the work for updating the buttons. So just a quick comment so we know what we're trying to create here. So we're going to assign the text value of each button. It's going to be either X or O, and that will be determined by the value that's stored in our game class or board class. So remember, the array of game has either a 0, 1, or 2 for each of the integers. And so if there's a 1 in the value of a square, then I want to place an X on the button. Now I'm going to ask a question. If game.grid is equal to 0, that means there's nobody owning that square yet. Then the button that is associated with that square will get a text value of blank or an empty string. However, if the board has a value of 1 stored in that spot, that means that's player 1 that is owning that. And we're going to assign the X symbol for the button. So the list of items in the array is either 0, 1, or 2. However, the values of the text are going to be either X, O, or blank. So the third one, of course, is if player 2 owns this location, then we'll assign text to be equal to the letter O. So one of these three conditions will be true, either blank, X, or O, based on either 0, 1, or 2. And so this update board should be able to display whatever we have in the value of game. Now before this will actually work, we need to assign something in the click event. So inside of this button handler, this button click handler, we're going to change the value of the game class based on the click. So what I'm going to do then is get the number of whatever was clicked and assign it to the game class at that location. So remember, this location goes from 0 to 8 for its index. And so I use the tag value because remember the tag contains an integer. However, the computer isn't quite sure that that's true. So he says, you have an object stored in the tag. I know it's an object. I can't guarantee it's an integer. And so we have a casting issue going on here. So I can't quite put in the word tag here. However, I can, first of all, assign tag to an integer. So I'll do that right above there. So on the line above it, I'm going to create a new variable that's an integer. And let's call it the game square number. So that's kind of like from 0 to 8. And I'm going to then get the value from the tag of the button. So does that work? Apparently not. I still have the same issue. I have this red underline. Let's go take a look at it, what it says. It's the same question. It says the tag is an object, but you are trying to assign it to an integer. You sure about that? We have to tell it we're going to make a cast. So we will add the explicit cast. This parentheses here says convert whatever tag is into an integer. So there's risk there that it could crash if in case I put something that's not an integer in the tag. However, I'm pretty sure that it's going to work. So this error goes away, and now inside of the square brackets I have an integer value which is called the game square number, and that should now assign it a value. So if we click a button, it's going to update the game class. Then finally I want to update the buttons, which I've just created, which is called update board. And putting that name in there will just trigger the function that is listed down here. Okay, so that's a little bit of coding. Let's see if these two things tie together. I'm going to run the app and try and click a button and see what happens. Okay, I got the app up and running. Let's go ahead and click something. So I click there and it says button 1 was clicked, and look at that, it's got an X. And we got an X again. So it is responding to my button click. Now the computer's not generating any answers, but at least it's taking my X's. And so that's progress. Now let's go and see if we can get the computer to make a guess after we do. So the place where we can make the computer do a guess is at the bottom here of this handle button click. We know that as soon as we've chosen something, it's now the computer's turn. So let's put in a note here. And we're going to let the computer do his work. So I'm going to invent a function name. I'm going to call it computer choose. And of course, it doesn't exist yet. So let's go to the suggestions and have the computer generate that function for us. So right below here is now this new function that says computer choose. So what do we want to do in computer choose? So let's put a comment in to know what we're trying to create here. So remember, when the computer chooses in this game, he picks a random number. And then we're going to update the game.grid property at that specific number. So we're going to have to do some of the work from our game class. So remember, up in the class list variables near the top here, we can declare a variable that is used throughout any of the functions that are below it. So we're going to create a random variable called rand. So I've already written this code in a previous version of this app. So I'm going to switch back into the other project and look at program.cs. You can see here that we have a while loop. Remember, this while loop was to make choices, a random choice, until it found an empty square. If it finds an empty square, then it's going to assign the computer's choice to that square. And it will repeat that as long as it keeps finding a square that's not empty. So when it's done, it should have one of the squares equal to a value of 2. So after the computer chooses another choice, let's go ahead and update the grid, update the board, so that way we can see any of the O's that come up. So let's go ahead and run the program and see if this does anything. Okay, the app is running, so I pick something, and it says you click number 1, and it put an X, and you can see that the random choice down here was O. Let's pick another one, and it says you picked one, and the computer chose over here. So we pick a few more, and eventually you're going to see the computer is going to print a few things, and you see down here in the console that the computer had to make multiple guesses. So there was really only one choice left. This square was available, and so it took a long time for the computer to actually guess the right one. And so we've got this here. Now if I click here, we're going to have a problem, and the computer now has gone into an infinite loop, and I have to press this little red button because the board is full, and it's still trying to find an empty square, and it will just try that forever. So we haven't built in that check to see if the board is full or not, but we'll do that next. So let's come back up to the top here where we have the handle button click, and we're going to check to see if the board is full. So I'm going to go back into the click handler, and I'm going to ask the question, is this board full? So after the human chooses something, it's a possibility that he picked the last item on the board. And so we don't want the computer to keep working. So I'm going to ask the question, is the board full? Equals to true. So this equals true is optional, but it's obvious now. And if it is true, if it's full, then we're going to put a message up that says, hey, sorry, the board is full. And then we're going to create a method called disable all buttons. So we're going to make the buttons grayed out so you can't click them. And that way we can't keep continuing the game. Now, if this is not true, then we're going to allow the computer to continue on. So let's put in an else statement and put the computer turn inside there. So the computer won't try to guess if the board is full. Now, what do we do with disable all buttons? And obviously, it doesn't work yet, so let's create another method, choosing the auto generate. And so disable all buttons is something that we can do quite easily. So disable all buttons is simply going through a for loop. We're going to go through each item in the list of buttons, and we'll set the property of enabled equal to false. So enabled is a true-false variable. If you set it to true, you can click the button. If you set it to false, the button's grayed out and you can't click it. So let's see if this does anything. Let's run it again. Okay, we got the game running, and we're going to have to get rid of this annoying pop-up, but anyway, we're going to get there. So there is no check for winner right now, so the computer would have won had I set that, but here we go. So this one is going to say all items are full, the board is full, and click OK, and you can see that I can no longer click on any of these buttons. They're grayed out, been taken, so can't choose those. We've at least got that part. Now let's check to see if we have a winner or not. Okay, so I'm going to insert another condition in the click listener. So we'll check first of all to see if the board is full. If it's not full, let's check to see if we won. So then that question is settled by this, as game.check for winner. If that comes back as a 1, that means the human won. That's the value of the first player. And then we'll just put a message up that says, hey, you won, and we'll also disable the buttons. And if that's not true, then we'll go to the last statement, which is an else that says, go ahead and let the computer choose. So let's see if this does anything. So now I got the game running. I'm going to choose a square here. I'm going to choose the center and the bottom left. Let's see what happens. So it says you clicked it. The human wins, and now all the buttons are disabled. So the game ends. Now we need to have a new game work, and also we have to check to see if the computer wins. So a few more things. All right, so we have an example of checking for the human to see if he or she wins. Can you do the same process for the computer's turn? So down here, we have computer chooses. When we get to the end and update the board, we should also to check for winners and to check for the game full. Check to see if the board is full. So here's a challenge. Can you make that happen? So I got some example code already to look at, but before I just show you the answer, see if you can code it and test it out. If you want to see how I do it, let's keep going. So I'm going to use the model from the previous event up here, and I'm going to copy this and just bring it down. So instead of asking if player 1 wins, and I'm going to put 2, and I'm going to say player computer wins, disable all the buttons, and away we go. Now, I don't want to have the computer do another turn, so I'm just going to take out the last condition. And so now we have 2 ifs. We have an else to say if the game is either full or there is a winner chosen. And then there's no other condition. So let's test it out and see if the computer can actually win. It's very hard for the computer to win. So I'll try to play dumb. I'm going to pick things where the computer has to choose the right square. Okay, come on, computer. Get smarter than that. We got 2. Let's see if that one will work. And he chose right there. It says player computer wins, and everything froze as disabled buttons. Now, the next step is, can I click new game and make it all work again? So let's do that next. So remember, we have a method for the new game button. If I double click it, it will bring me into this button 10 clicked. This is where we want to start a new game. So we're going to create 2 statements in here. The first one is to create a new version of the game. So we'll say game equals a new board. And so that'll redefine all of the properties there. Then I want to also reset the buttons. I want to enable them, and I want to set their text to be blank. So I'm going to create a method and call it enable buttons, enable all buttons. So it doesn't exist, of course, so I have to tell the computer to generate it for me. So let's go ahead and select that. And then inside of here, we're going to do the same process that we did to disable the buttons, but this time we're going to change them to be enabled. So if we want to enable all the buttons, then we have to go through a for loop. So we'll say a for each loop. We'll say for each item in the buttons list, we'll set the property of each item to be enabled equals true. And then after we're done with the loop, let's go ahead and update the board again so it'll redisplay the text on all the buttons. So we'll set the text to be blank, and of course, all the X's and O's should disappear. There's one more thing I'm going to do before I test this time. I'm going to remove that annoying dialog box on this click event. So where was that? It says you clicked button right here. That was good for testing, but it's no longer useful. So let's go ahead and put that in there and try again. All right, so let's test it out again. So I'm going to see if I can win. I'm going to choose the first, the second, and the it doesn't let me do there. Let's go with that column. And then it says human player wins. All right, we got it. Notice that the board now has been disabled, and let's choose new game. We can start over and play all over again. We have a problem. If you notice, I can click the O, and I can overwrite the O. So that is not a good thing. So I can decide to win just by taking away the O's. I certainly hope that is not something you would want to allow in your game. So we need to check before a button can be clicked if we're going to allow it. So here's one way to do it. So we could just disable the button after the user clicks it, and that way you can't click it again. So let's go into the update board command here, and let's see if we can disable some of the buttons if they've already been claimed. So let's go through these three cases here. So in the first case, the button value is 0, so that should be able to be claimed by somebody. So let's say that this button at its position I is going to be enabled. So let's say enables equals true. Now for the other cases, that should be false. So when we go through this, we're going to either enable the button because it's got a 0 on it, or disable it because it's either got the value 1 or 2. So anything that has been claimed by either the computer or the human should now be disabled. Let's see if that works. Okay, we got the app going, and when I click a button now, you can see that it is now disabled. And so you can see the O is still there, but we can't click it. So now if I click all three of them, human wins, and now they're all disabled. We choose new game, and let's see if we can start over. Yeah, it seems to work now. So the game logic seems to work. One more thing I'm going to do is change the font on the buttons. So let's go back to the design here. I'm going to hold the shift key down and select each button. So I'm going to do a select all basically. And now I'm going to go to the text, and let's see if we can change the size. Is there something about font sizes here? Here it is. So font, and there is a size. So let's just push it up to maybe 40. And so now it's got button for each of these. However, that will just be a single letter. Also, I'd like to change the font color. So let's go and update the button font face. There, so let's go ahead and update the properties of the forecolor for each of these buttons. So if we have a blank, actually it doesn't matter what color it is, but I'm going to set the color of the text to black. So that is forecolor equals color.black. Now if it is an X value, let's pick a color for that one. So I'm going to just choose red, and then for the O's, I'm going to pick a different color and green. So that'll just make this game a little bit more visual so people can see better who's who. Let's try and run it and see if the font size and color changed here. So I click one. So the colors are actually not displaying because they only display if a button is active. If it's disabled, it goes back to gray. So much for that idea. The colors aren't really making any effect whatsoever. But you can see them better now since they're larger. So if you learned anything from this activity, make sure that you subscribe and come back to class. My name is Shad Sluter, and I'm a professor of computer science and software development at Grand Canyon University. And so every day in class, we learn some kind of a challenge with programming, and I welcome you to join us because you can become a software developer with the material that you can find right here on this channel. So thanks for coming, and see you again.